Chapter 19. The fourth day of the fifth moon began with a bang of firecrackers, a great many bangs, as a matter of fact. It was the feast of poisonous insects that warms things up for the dragon boat race of the double fifth, and usually it's a merry affair. But not this time. The heat wave hadn't broken and rain still hadn't fallen. And everybody knows that when there is no fluctuation in weather for an extended period of time, an unhealthy atmosphere is created in which sickness spreads like swarms of locusts, and great plagues begin their incubation cycles, and horrible omens tend to appear. Flesh and frogs falling from heaven, for example, or hens turning into roosters. Children enjoyed themselves, of course. They'd been laboriously embroidering tigers on their slippers for months, and their mothers dressed them in black and yellow striped tiger tunics, and they shrieked with delight as they hopped around the streets, stamping imaginary scorpions and centipedes and spiders, or battled clowns dressed as toads and snakes and lizards, with long leaves of changpu grass, shaped like the blades of swords. The parents dutifully set off firecrackers and daubed everyone's ears and noses with streaks of sulphur as a precaution against poisonous bites, but their eyes were worried and their faces were drawn as they watched heat waves again lift from the streets. The temples were crowded with grandparents praying to Kuan Yin, goddess of mercy. Tempers were rubbed raw. A bloody battle erupted at the dynastic gate when a herd of sheep with red-painted tails, meaning they were being led to sacrifice at the altar of heaven, somehow got entangled with camels on their way to the caravan loading area on the other end of the city, and nobody could go anywhere for 2 hours. The Mongol herders were forced by custom to wear heavy sheepskin robes caked with grease, and the Turkish camel drivers were bound to their thick, grimy robes and huge felt-lined boots, and everybody was melting, furious at the world, and spoiling for a fight. I mention the incident because Master Li and I got trapped in the middle of it when we set out early that morning for the Celestial Master's house, and we had to abandon the palanquin and hack our way through the mobs, and eventually hire another one. And when we finally reached the house, we were told by a soldier guarding the gate that the saint had indeed returned late at night, but had already left for the Forbidden City. I didn't know what to think, and Master Li had withdrawn into his own thoughts the moment we left the executioner's office the previous night, and he was still uncommunicative. We entered the Forbidden City without incident, and instead of going straight to the Celestial Master's office, the sage made a stop at the Bureau of Import. When he came back out a short time later, the look on his face suggested that at least one thought sequence had paid off. "Ox," he said as he climbed back into the palanquin. "I should have done this earlier, but things kept happening to distract me. Do you remember the drugs I used to turn cheap bohi into tribute tea?" I turned red. "No, sir," I said. "Prussiate of iron, sulfate of lime, and powder from the fruit of the tamarind tree," he said patiently. "That last item is rare. Very little is imported, and one must be licensed to buy it. One legacy of late unlamented legalism is the requirement that companies requesting such licenses must list the names of all corporate officers. Secrecy can still be maintained because such lists are filed by the company name. An investigator has to have the name before he can ask for the file, and some of the names are quite ingenious. Suppose you were one of a group of mandarins involved in a counterfeit tea racket. Suppose you were able to communicate with each other because of old cages, and suppose the use of the cages was explained by a rubbing of an ancient frieze, and suppose you didn't want people asking for your file. What would you call your company?" He knew very well I couldn't answer that. He let me stew in confusion for a moment, and then he took out a piece of paper upon which a clerk had obligingly copied a list of company officers beneath the corporate name Master Li had specified. "Sky Flame Death Birds Ghost Boat Rain Race Tea Company, Limited." "This is the bunch?" I asked admiringly. "Exactly. Every bastard involved, including Lee the cat and 2 other eunuchs of ministerial rank, Master Lee said. Now if only— He let the sentence die a natural death. He meant if only the Celestial Master is sane and in one piece and able to help. And worry returned, and he was silent the rest of the way to the Hall of Literary Profundity. There we were told that we had just missed the Celestial Master, who had hobbled out for his morning walk, but we would surely find him on the lawn leading to the palaces of the young princes. Master Lee dismissed the palanquin and set out on foot, and both of us stopped in our tracks and let out long sighs when we reached the lawn. Ahead of us, painfully pushing his canes toward Nine Dragons' screen, was the unmistakable form of the Celestial Master, unchanged from the last time we'd seen him. I had feared torture, Master Lee said quietly. So had I, since that or insanity was the only explanation I could think of for the saint's signature on a terrible execution order. Now Master Lee had to face the likelihood that, for once, he'd made an error judging calligraphy, and the signature had been forged, but the prospect didn't seem to bother him. He was almost cheerful as we took a shortcut past the archery grounds, but when we came to Nine Dragons' screen, there was no Celestial Master. Ha! That was a remarkable optical illusion, Master Lee said. I could have sworn he was right here, but look. He pointed to the left and far ahead, and my eyes bulged as I saw a small, distant figure, hunched over a pair of canes, inching like an arthritic snail past the gate of the bestowal of awards toward the gate of peaceful old age. Better carry me. Somebody must have given him a lift, and it's too damn hot for my rickety legs. I took the old man on my back and started off again, but soon we were out of sight of the saint, wending our way through mazes of high hedges. The gardens of the Forbidden City are for aristocrats, not peasants, so every view is planned for eyes riding at ease at palanquin level. Pedestrians can't see much of anything until they reach clear spaces, and when I got to a clear space, I stopped so suddenly, Master Lee almost bounced over my head, and when he was settled again, I asked in a tiny voice, "Sir, can there be more than one Celestial Master?" The ancient sage was so far past the gate of peaceful old age that he had actually reached the great theatre, and I would have been hard-pressed to cover the distance in the elapsed time, even at a trot. "Let's concentrate on this one," Master Lee said in a tight, grim voice. "Catch 'em, Mox." I took off at a run, taking an angle to come out far ahead of him, and I kept racing through lanes of flowering oleander and pomegranate until I panted to a halt at the well of the Pearl Concubine. I turned and looked back where the saint should be. There was no slow shuffling figure, and I saw nothing to my right. Ahead of me was the outer wall of the Forbidden City, so the only direction remaining was left, and I turned and almost toppled over. Far, far away, between the Hall of Imperial Peace and the Pavilion of 10,000 Springs, a tiny stooped figure was straining to move a pair of canes ahead of his shuffling feet. Master Lee was very still on my back. Then his hands squeezed my shoulders. "Let's try something," he said quietly. "Turn away and cut between the palaces of tranquil earth and sympathetic harmony, as though we're giving up and making for West Flowery Gate." I did as I was told, and in a few seconds I was again running through mazes of shrubs and trees, and after about 4 minutes, Master Lee told me to stop, double back, and take the first opening to the left. I climbed a small hill and got down on my stomach and wormed through low shrubs, and Master Lee reached past my ears and parted a pair of leafy branches. We were looking out across the long velvet lawn in front of the Palace of Established Happiness, and my liver turned ice cold. The Celestial Master was racing across the lawn like a panther, stooped low, leaping gracefully over obstacles. His simple Taoshi robe billowed behind him like a kite, and he was running so fast the robe's 10 ribbons and cloud-embroidered sash were popping in the air like the blurred wings of racing pigeons. He leaped over a huge stone I would have had to climb, hanging suspended in air, legs spread like a dancer's, and pushed down with his canes to give his body an extra forward vault as he hit the ground. The saint sped on until he reached the hall of the nurture of the mind. Had we continued on the path we had taken, we would now be coming out of the shrubbery in view of the hall and of the celestial master. And suddenly he stopped, and tentatively extended his canes, and an aged, frail, crippled gentleman was painfully pushing himself across the gates. "Sir, sir, sir." Why the note of surprise? We haven't witnessed a miracle since a disembodied doghead chewed the Grand Warden. So we were overdue, Master Lee said in a high, hard voice. "Ox, back to the Hall of Literary Profundity, and hurry." At the hall he had me go around the side and through a maze of little gardens, and then he pried a window open, and we climbed through. He picked a lock, made his way through an empty office, had me carry him out the side window and across a balcony, and we climbed through another window into the office of the Celestial Master. Remember the little object like a brush used by the 8 skilled gentlemen to activate the cages? I assume the Celestial Master had one when he sent his message to the mandarins. "Find it," Master Lee ordered. The room was crowded with mementos of more than a century of service, and it could have taken us a month to search it all, but now and then the obvious choice pays off. Master Lee overturned the jar of writing brushes and pawed through them, and suddenly his hand stopped. Slowly he picked up a brush and held it to the light. It was incredibly old, with a stone handle and a tip made from the tail of a musk deer. "Same period, same type of craftsmanship, and same feel to it," Master Lee muttered. We went outside again, back in the silent, shadowed recesses of the library garden. Nobody was around. Master Lee wasn't going to take any chances with the cage we'd almost been killed for in the mandarin's greenhouse. He had it firmly tied to his belt beneath his robe, and he took it out and examined it with speculative eyes. "We know that it's activated for sending messages by touching the symbols of the 5 elements with the brush," he said thoughtfully. "What I'm hoping is that it also retains messages. If so, one would logically assume the doctrine of the 5 is also involved, such as the 5 colors, directions, seasons, celestial stems, mountains, planets, virtues, emotions, animals, orifices, tissues, or flavors. My knowledge of the 5 begins and ends with the fact that the odor and sound connected with the planet Mercury are putrid and groaning, so I kept my mouth shut. It took some time, because there was a maze of symbols engraved on the bars, but finally he decided to try the animals associated with the seasons in backward order, and I jumped a foot into the air when the brush touched the head of a tortoise. A sudden glow of light filled the cage, and then I was looking at the face of a mandarin I didn't know. He was obviously struggling with fear and rage as he tried to keep himself under control. "Why haven't we killed the old fool?" he demanded. A tick jumped in his left cheek. "I must know. I demand to know. Why haven't we killed him? Don't you fools realize that since the cat dealt with that clerk, we have corpses to account for? If we don't slit Lee Cow's throat, he'll toss us to the dogs." Touching the tiger got us another mandarin, demanding Master Lee's head, and the water buffalo and phoenix produced boring messages about trading routes and sales figures. Then Master Lee touched the brush to the dragon, and the face that filled the cage was that of the Celestial Master. From the first scathing words I realized this was the message Master Lee sought, the message to Lee the cat and the Grand Warden of Goosegate we had almost heard, but not quite. "Stick the turd-stained tips of your fingers into your ears and dig out the dung beetles, because I am about to demonstrate the error of your half-witted ways." Oh, he flayed them. He turned them inside out. Acid scoured the air as he depicted the idiocy of getting involved in some sort of smuggling racket that could lead to the 1,000 cuts, confiscation of estates, loss of rank and privilege for entire families, and the near certainty that pauperized wives and concubines and children would be led to the auction block and sold as slaves. "You idiot! If you idiots have to steal, why not steal something worthwhile?" the saint roared. "In the process you might each do good despite yourselves and contribute to the restoration of morality. Listen to me, my wayward children, and I shall lead you toward the light." Then he led them toward the light, and I listened with disbelief, and then horror, and then despair, to an agonizing degree I have seldom known. The celestial master was proposing to revive the ghost scheme of Confucius. Barbarians must understand that in a civilized country, the dead are immensely influential. The living are far too busy with the process of staying alive to pay attention to anything else. Human senses are, in actuality, the 6 evils, because sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell, and thought are barriers against the messages of heaven. Only the dead are free from such shackles, and when the ghost of an ancestor appears in moonlight or in dreams and bears a cryptic message, it is the most important event in a family's existence. Sometimes it's a hugely dramatic warning. The black stag god is angry, and you must flee the valley before influenza strikes. And sure enough, 10 people who stayed behind die from influenza. Sometimes it's a great-grandmother appearing in a dream to provide the perfect protective milk name for a new baby. And speaking of babies, who doesn't know of the ghost of a child who died at birth suddenly appearing to make an older brother jump back in fright, just before that brother's foot was to land on a poisonous snake? The power of ghosts is awesome, and their pronouncements are unchallengeable. Confucius knew that, and it inspired a brilliant scheme. He counseled his aristocratic clients to grind the lower classes into the mud once and for all by imposing strict ghost laws. The only ghosts recognized to be valid would be those that had the decency and civility to appear at a properly hallowed shrine in a respectable family temple. And who could afford hallowed shrines in private temples? Aristocrats, of course, and no peasants need apply. Any claim to ancestral lines by those without decent family estates would be greeted by lashes of the rod. A second occurrence would mean mutilation. A third would merit death. Any claim to having received a message from a family ghost by one too low to have a family in the feudal Confucian sense would be justification for being sold into slavery. What made the ghost scheme so glorious was the fact that it was without limits. An aristocrat who coveted fertile land belonging to a commoner merely had to reveal that the ghost of his great-great-great-uncle had appeared to tell him that the land in question actually belonged to the family, and deeds to that effect would be found in the brass box in the cellar. If need be, the ghost could reappear to explain that the deeds may have been written on paper that hadn't been invented at the time of the supposed transaction, but that merely applied to the earth. The paper had already been invented in heaven, and the gods had graciously presented the great-great-great-uncle with a sample. Any legal challenge was referred to a feudal court composed of other aristocratic landowners, and as Confucius himself so charmingly put it, the superior man is like wind, and the common man is like grass. When the wind blows, the grass bends. In the days of Confucius, there was no empire. China was a collection of squabbling feudal states, and the single most important reason for the ghost scheme never being put to full effect once the empire was formed was Taoism. The Daoshis battled tooth and nail to protect the rights of the peasantry, but now the celestial master, leader of Taoists and the empire's greatest living saint, was proposing that the mandarins put the profits from their illegal operation into judiciously placed bribes, and together with his immense influence and active support, the ghost scheme could at last be installed throughout China. In practically no time, only aristocrats would be entitled to power, property, and legal protection, with, as the Celestial Master put it, unimaginable improvement in public morality and civility. I should mention that throughout this incredible speech, the saint showed no signs of senility. Indeed, I had never heard him so forceful and coherent. And when he finally ended his proposal and the cage went dark, I turned helplessly to Master Li. "Sir, can he have suffered some sort of a stroke?" I asked. Rarely have I seen the old man as perturbed as he was then. He was furiously chewing the end of his scraggly beard as he thought, and then spat it out and said, "I've yet to hear of a stroke that allows an arthritic centenarian to race across lawns like a Tibetan snow leopard. No, Ox, something far more dramatic than a cerebral disorder is going on, and the consequences could be almost beyond imagining." He had been sitting cross-legged in front of the cage. Now he jumped up and gazed at the searing, brassy sky. The yellow wind was a huge hand lifted above the horizon, great grasping fingers reaching toward a sun that was blood-red and pulsing in haze as it began to set. I hadn't realized so much time had passed, and fine grains were whipping against branches and leaves, hissing, scraping. A giant invisible cat at a scratching post, playfully unsheathing its claws. "Something as dramatic as a solstice that doesn't take place," Master Li said softly. "My boy, few disciplines are more dismal than theology, but it may be important to consider the doctrine of disaster, which is the Han Dynasty's chief contribution to the subject. Both the I Ching and the Huai Nan Tzu assert that natural disasters are not caused by heaven, but allowed by heaven. If men willfully disrupt the natural order of things, the gods will refuse to intervene when nature purges itself of the toxin, usually violently, and if the innocent suffer along with the guilty, well, the only way men learn anything is to have it smashed into their heads with an axe." He picked up the cage and retied it to his belt and covered it with his flowing robe. "According to 6th degree Osler 2, Aborigines believe envy almost caused a solstice disaster that was prevented by 8 skilled gentlemen," he said slowly. "We know damn well that either envy or an incredibly talented impersonator is still with us and up to something. And the problem with Chinese myths is that in China it's difficult to tell where myth ends and reality begins. The august personage of Jade will not be pleased to receive a petition to install the ghost scheme from the leader of Taoists, but that in itself shouldn't—" He fell silent, and then he told me to bend over and take him on my back. "All we can do now is go down that list of involved mandarins and find the weak link. You may have to break a few of the bastard's bones, my boy, but one way or another he's going to enable us to toss the rest of them in jail," the sage said grimly. "Back to the city and One-Eyed Wong's, and hurry." "Yes, sir," I said, and I took off like a racehorse.